Nikki Verstappen was born on the March 13, 1987 to Peter and Berthe Verstappen in Heibel Lem, in the district of Limburg, the Netherlands. He had a loving family and was the eldest of 2 children. Nikki and his younger sister, Femke, loved to play together. Nikki, who lived in a small community of 800 people, would frequently cycle all over his hometown of Heibloem. This made many people know him. He was described as friendly and a laid-back young kid. He was also known to be a happy and well-adjusted young man. His mother described him as spontaneous and sporty. At the time, when people think of Nikki Verstappen, it was hard not to recollect the Amsterdam soccer team. Ajax, Nikki was practically a die-hard fan who would never miss a match. Nikki was said to have played soccer himself, and he also was known to be a good player. The annual summer camp for the 8 to 12 years olds came, and on Saturday, August 1998, Nikki Verstappen and 36 other school children from his school took the bus on a 45-minute journey from Heblum to the town of Brunsum in order to take part in the children's summer camp being held on the De Heikop camping grounds on the Brunsummerheide. It was known that every kid from Heigloheim had the opportunity to attend this summer camp every year. Nikki Verstappen, who had encouraged himself to go because of his best friend, got a bit disappointed when his best friend pulled out and decided to stay back home at the last minute. Nikki, however, decided to still go for the summer camp. He stayed on the bus as he waved his friend goodbye. On arrival at the De Heikop camping grounds, the children were divided into their various tent groups. All 37 kids were split into 10 tents, while the 4 remaining tents were shared among the 12 camp leaders. According to camp tradition, each group had to name their tents. The name was also the name of their team. Nikki Verstappen's tent, which he shared with 4 other boys his age who were his friends, was named Night Riders. Just like his mother promised, the first day of summer camp was a lot of fun with games and team-building activities. Later that night, they all gathered around a campfire while one of the leaders narrated scary ghost stories. Around 10 p.m., the kids were sent to bed, while the camp leaders stayed up until midnight eating and drinking. Summer camp started off on a great path. Everyone retired to their tents for the night, feeling happy with the anticipation of a more exciting day, as there were a lot of fun-filling activities planned for the following day. Around 5 a.m. on the August 10th, 1998, one of Nikki Verstappen's tent mate woke up to go use the toilet. At that time, the remaining tent mates, including Nikki, were still sleeping. Around 6 a.m., another kid from the Night Riders tent woke up and realized Nikki Verstappen was gone. Their initial thoughts was that he had gone to the toilet. However, 2 hours later, at 8 a.m., when the trumpet for breakfast time was played, and Nikki had not still returned, his tent mates became worried. They then told their camp leaders that Nikki had gone out of their tent since 6 a.m. and had not returned. Everyone at the campsite, including the campers and camp leaders, started looking for Nikki Verstappen all over the campsite. They searched for him and called out his name numerous times, but he could not be found. Since Nikki Verstappen had been unsure of coming to summer camp, the leaders thought that he had ran away. His parents in Heibloem were then called and told that he had disappeared from the campsite and his whereabouts could not be located. This came as a shock to Nikki's parents. His mother, Berthe Verstappen, sensed something was wrong. To her, she knows her son would never opt and leave the camp without informing anyone since he was quite nervous about going away from home in the first place. It did not make any sense that he would go off on his own. Berthe and Peter then quickly left Heibloem and traveled down to the campsite to look for their son. When they got to the campsite, Berthe noticed that Nikki's shoes were still in the tent. She felt if he had planned to run away, definitely he would have worn his shoes. Nikki's parents then joined the camp leaders to search all over the campsite, desperately calling Nikki's name, but unfortunately, there was no answer. By midday, they came to a conclusion to call in the police. Later that afternoon, the search party had grown significantly. There was a massive turnout of volunteers which were mostly friends and family from Heibloem, as well as from the local town of Brunson. They took turns to wait at Nikki's tent and to go out and look for Nikki in the surrounding bushes and fields. The search party frantically looked for Nikki. The police, to a great extent, interrogated all the camp leaders and went to all the homes surrounding the campsite to ask if residents had maybe come across an 11-year-old boy, but it didn't yield anything. Even though Nikki's family insisted that something was seriously wrong, the search party had no real sense of panic. The only general feeling they had was that Nikki Verstappen had left the campsite by himself and had got lost in the woods. They believed he was okay and were expecting him to be found alive and well. The day of the search appeared to have been one of the hottest days of the whole summer of 1998. It was 95 degrees and it made the search even more exhausting. Camp leaders took turns to look for Nikki, while others kept the kids at the campsite occupied with activities. In the evening, armed forces were contacted to join in the search, while the kids were sent to their tents like nothing happened. While they slept, the military vehicles and searchers frantically called out Nikki's name into the darkness of the night. By the next morning, on Tuesday, Nikki was still nowhere to be found, so the camp leaders felt there was no need for camping anymore if one of them was lost. They then decided to cancel the camp. Every kid was placed in a bus and taken back home to Hebelim, while the search party intensified their search efforts. The more they searched for Nikki Verstappen, the more it became clear that he didn't run away. The police used their dogs for the search as well, and an aerial search of the campsite was done using a plane. All efforts to find Nikki yielded no results, and by sunset, the search party was running out of daylight. Finally, around 9 p.m. on Tuesday, August 1998, Nikki Verstappen's uncle, who was part of the search party, noticed something laying underneath a small pine tree. On getting closer, he saw the lifeless body of 11-year-old Nikki Verstappen. Nikki was found in a pine grove on the Schinwaldeweg in Landgraf, less than a mile away from the campsite. He was wearing his red Ajax pajama pants and blue underpants, and was naked from the waist up. His pajamas pants, which he got as a Christmas present from the previous year, were turned inside out and the front was placed to the back. Nikki had sustained a wound to his head, but at first glance, the wound did not look serious enough to have caused his death. Even though he was found in a pine grove, close to farmlands and bushes, Nikki's feet were clean. He seemed like he did not walk to the place where he was found. People believed that he was killed somewhere else, and his body was carried down to the place he was found. The spot Nikki Verstappen was found was near a parking lot that was known for where homosexual men would meet for secret sex. Aside that, movement around that area was limited. By midnight, Nikki Verstappen's body was taken to a mortuary in Mastiac, about 30 minutes away from the campsite. The people of Heigloem came together to assist Nikki's family in arranging a memorial service for him. The memorial service took place at Heigloem Sports Fields on Saturday, August 1998, a week after he left home for summer camp, since Nikki was wildly known in Heigloem. 600 people attended his funeral. His love for Ajax was recognized at his funeral. His coffin was covered with the red Ajax flag, which was something he would have loved. His family would never remain the same again as they were left in a state of shock and grief. Nikki's parents felt guilty for encouraging their son to go for summer camp, even when he confided in them that he was unsure of the trip. Who killed Nikki Verstappen? His family wanted answers and closure. Somebody needed to be held accountable for killing their son and brother, but the police had no leads whatsoever. Seeing that it was unlikely for Nikki to have gone off with a stranger, the police interviewed the camp leaders again. Unfortunately, nothing that could help solve the case was discovered. Nikki's post-mortem examination took place 3 days after his death. Since he was murdered in the summer of the holiday period, Nikki's family had to wait for 2 months before the results of the autopsy was released. According to the autopsy report, Nikki Verstappen was drugged and his body showed signs of sexual abuse. However, medical examiner was unable to determine a cause of death. Due to this, a second autopsy was carried out, and its result had the same conclusion with the first. There was a possibility that Nikki was sexually assaulted, but his cause of death could not be determined. Even though suffocation was suggested as his cause of death, there was not enough evidence to prove it once and for all. Following Nikki's murder, an extensive investigation was carried out, but the case went cold and would remain unsolved for 20 years. The police had to use the evidence they have. Close to the parking lot, about 100 yards from where Nikki Verstappen was found, a tissue containing semen a cigarette butt and beer bottle top were retrieved. The forensics then compiled a DNA profile of a person other than Nikki, though it was not definite that the tissue was related to Nikki's murder case since people often met in the parking lot and have sex in the woods. In 1997, a year before Nikki Verstappen's murder, a DNA database was created at the National Forensics Institute of the Netherlands. At the time, DNA testing was the new forensic technology and tests were a little bit restricted. Also, any DNA testing on the database could only be handled by the prosecutor and not the police. At that time, the police did not have their own database, and they did not have first-hand access to the national database without an approval from the prosecutor. This made the process of quickly finding a killer somewhat slow and difficult. During the investigation of Nikki Verstappen's murder, DNA samples of 40 men were taken. The men included camp leaders, some men from a campsite nearby, and other male visitors in the area at the time of Nikki's death. However, none of the DNA matched the profile found in the tissue at the crime scene. Even if the retrieved tissue with salmon was probably a leftover of a sexual encounter that had nothing to do with Nikki's death, the investigators still could not strike out the evidence. Later in the investigation, there was a glimmer of hope when a single hair, similar in color to that of Nikki's, was found in the trunk of a car which belonged to one of the camp leaders. After the hair sample was sent to the UK for DNA testing, it was however discovered that it did not belong to Nikki. Immediately, the autopsy results were out. The first person of interest was Jules Barton, an 80-year-old founder of the camp Nikki and his classmates went. Jules Barton was the former principal of Nikki's school in High Blame. He had lost his job after he was convicted of child sexual abuse in the 1950s. During interrogation, he had also confessed that he was near Nikki Verstappen's tent at 6 a.m. on the morning of his disappearance. But he did not go there for Nikki. He said he went there to check on one of the boys who had burnt his hand the night before. Jules Barton's alibi was that when he woke up at 5 a.m., he cleaned his tent and then went to check on the boy who burnt his hand. After which, he then drove back to Hebloem to attend the funeral of a friend who had died. He claimed to have heard about Nikki Verstappen's disappearance at the funeral and went straight back to the camp. Jules Barton was on the police radar for some time, and this was because he exhibited strange behavior during the search for Nikki Verstappen. He kept steering the search in the direction of the place where Nikki's body was found. He also gave the information that the parking lot near the crime scene was a place where men often meet for sex. The police was uncomfortable about Jules Barton. They decided to look into his background. Even though he was a respected member of his community, he had been convicted for child sexual assault and was imprisoned for 3 months before he was let go and allowed to work with kids again. Several years later, photos of young boys who were shirtless or in their underpants were discovered on him, though there were no proofs that he further molested any male child at the time. However, after Nikki Verstappen's death, a 15-year-old girl came forward and said that she had every reason to believe Jules Barton had sexually molested her when she attended summer camp earlier that year in 1998. She claimed she was unwell one evening and Jules Barton had given her medication that turned out to be sleeping drugs for adults. She said when she woke up, her clothes were messy and different from the way they were when she went to bed. The girl also claimed to have experienced lower abdominal pain and discomfort. The police, however, could not do anything about her confession since she did not report the incident earlier. After much interrogation, Jules Barton could not be arrested due to lack of sufficient evidence to pin him to the kidnapping and murder of Nikki Verstappen. A reward of 250,000 guilders was offered for any lead that could bring the suspect to justice. As time went, Nikki's family became frustrated as they sensed lack of urgency in solving their son's murder. They resorted to a well-known television crime reporter at the time, Peter de Vries, and asked him to help them to solve the mystery surrounding their son's death. Peter de Vries agreed to help them look into the case. Over the years, his involvement in the case turned out to be a salvation for Nikki's family. Peter de Vries launched a campaign on behalf of the Verstappen's family, and the reward money was doubled to 500,000 guilders by unknown business people. In April 1999, the first in-depth documentary about Nikki's murder case was broadcast nationally. The documentary talked about Jules Barton's child sexual assault in the past. It brought up questions like, why was he allowed to work with children after being a convicted sex offender? The documentary seemed to put pressure on the police to investigate Deuce Barton further. This divided the small community of Hiploem. Nikki's case threatened to tear the community apart. While some people wanted to protect the founder of the camp, some people supported Nikki's family in their quest to find out the truth, even if it meant asking confronting questions. As time went by, majority of the people in High Bloem chose to stay away from Nikki's family. They believed the Verstappens were out on a witch hunt. Nikki's family only held on to a handful of faithful friends who supported them through the case. In July of 1999, Nikki Verstappen's case was ruled unsolved. The next month, in August, Bertie and Peter Verstappen had an opportunity to meet with Queen Beatrix, the former Queen of the Netherlands. They handed her a letter, which was an official complaint about the slow investigation in the death of their son. Due to this, efforts were subsequently intensified by the prosecutor in Maastricht to solving the case. In February 2001, Nikki's grandparents and the town of Brunsum silently built a monument for Nikki at the spot where his body was found. This didn't make Nikki's parents feel any better. His mother, Bertie, would always light a candle in their family home every morning as soon as she woke up. She did this for 20 years. In an interview with Peter de Vries, she said, "I wake up at night and hear his voice. He calls me. I get up and go to look for Nikki, but he is no longer there." Their happy and complete family of 4 had become an unhappy, incomplete, and broken family of 3. Since answers were not forthcoming at the time, Bertie, who did not let that stop her, had promised on national TV to bring the killer of her child to justice as long as she was still alive. In February, Bertie and Peter Verstappen wrote a public letter to the Minister of Justice, asking for help on their son's case. They claimed to be at the mercy of the police and the legal systems, but they have no answers. The legal system then decided to act as there appeared to have been a total breakdown in trust by the people of High Bloem. The general public were getting disappointed at the police and the legal systems for not giving answers as to who killed Nikki Verstappen. In that same year, the case was renewed and a second opinion task force was given the case to investigate from scratch. On the June 29, 2001, the investigative team was able to determine the time of Nikki's death. His time of death was estimated to have been between 2 p.m. on the August 10th or 9 a.m. on the August 11th. It means Nikki Verstappen was alive for at least 8 hours before he was murdered. New DNA technology also discovered that there were little drops of blood on Nikki's pajamas. One of the drops was tested for foreign DNA, but it turned out to be that of Nikki. Further investigation revealed many mistakes made by the first set of investigators that made the case become cold for some time. One of the mistakes was that these investigators focused on the scene where Nikki was found. They used that spot as the crime scene, forgetting that Nikki's feet were clean when he was found, which suggested that he did not walk to that place himself. He was carried away from the main crime scene and dumped at the spot he was found. The first investigation did not look for possible evidence beyond the pine tree where Nikki was found. Even the campsite where Nikki was last seen was not properly considered for possible clues that could pinpoint the killer. As time unfolds, Deuce Barton was not the only suspects in the case. In 1998, at the time that Nikki and his friends were camping, there appeared to have been another group from the Roldock Seminary who pitched their tents nearby. A man named Roldock's chef had piqued the interest of the police, and this was because he had once had an inappropriate contact with a child before. They believed he was someone who would do it again. On the morning of Nikki Verstappen's disappearance, Rolder Chef was not at the campsite. When questioned, he appeared to have no alibi for his whereabouts at the time. However, he died in 1999 before the police could find enough evidence to arrest him. Also, a man simply known as Vim was another person of interest at the time. Vim was a sex offender from a town nearby. Different witnesses spotted him near the Haycop campsite in a dark-colored vehicle around August 10, 1998. He was questioned by the police in February 2001, 2003, 2006, and February 2007 anytime a witness came forward pointing a finger at him. Unfortunately, there was no sufficient evidence to pin him to the crime, and in February 2007 he died at the age of 64. Until his death, Vim had said he never killed Nikki Verstappen. Martin Ney, the German serial killer, was someone the police could not afford to overlook in this case. He had killed 3 boys and had sexually molested at least 40 children between 1992 and February 2001. Martin Ney was known as the Masked Man or the Black Man, and this is because he used to wear black clothing and a creepy black mask. His victims were usually hunted by him at campsites or in children's homes. Since the Hekop campsite was located close to the Dutch-German border and one of Ney's proven crimes was committed in the Netherlands, he was considered as a serious suspect. However, when he was eventually arrested for all his crimes in February 2001, Martin Ney denied any involvement in Nikki Verstappen's murder. As the investigation progresses, the police had quite a number of suspects on their list. The likes of Michel Fournier and Mark Hoffman, who were sex offenders at the time, were considered suspects to Nikki Verstappen's homicide case, but thorough investigation vindicated them, and they were never charged with his murder. In February 2004, Peter de Vries became aware of new testing techniques in the science of DNA. He then informed the public and told the police to re-examine the blood found on Nikki Verstappen's clothing. In February 2005, an anonymous person placed letters on Nikki's memorial in Bronzum, claiming to have been responsible for killing him. Investigators traced the letters to a 36-year-old man, but it turned out to be a false confession. The man was a psychiatric patient who had severe mental health issues. His therapist explained that he had written the letters as a way of getting attention. The man was placed in custody for 2 weeks for vandalizing Nikki Verstappen's grave. In February 2008, when it seemed like all hope was lost, detectives announced that foreign DNA had been found on Nikki's pajamas, pants, and his underpants. Previous suspects in the case were all retested, but there were still no matches to the DNA found. Nevertheless, Nikki's family was positive. It might seem like another dead end, but the discovery of the foreign DNA profile meant there was proof of a male individual being in physical contact with Nikki Verstappen before his death. Nikki's family prayed and hoped that the perpetrator would be found before he could hurt any other person. In the year 2010, Nikki Verstappen's sister Femke, who was in her 20s by then, made a public appeal to every man in the community to participate in a DNA testing so that the family could have some sense of closure. After the appeal, the police gathered a list of over 100 men. These men were initially part of the search party in camp management. 80 out of 114 men agreed to provide saliva swabs. Even though it was quite a high number of turnouts for the DNA analysis, Peter de Vries took to the media again to encourage people to be partakers of the DNA tests. It seemed a lot of these men were scared of leaving their DNA samples because they do not want to be caught for a past crime. However, after Peter de Vries explained that their DNAs would only be used for the Nikki Verstappen's case, additional 40 men came forward. After carrying out a comprehensive test on the retrieved DNA samples, there was still no match to the DNA found on Nikki's clothing. In a desperate attempt to find the truth, the remains of Just Barton, who had died in February 2003, were exhumed for testing. There was hope at that point since Just Barton had been the strongest suspect throughout the years. However, many people became surprised when the DNA of Just Barton did not match the DNA found on Nikki Verstappen's clothes. In the early days of 2012, Nikki Verstappen's homicide case was transferred to a cold case team. The new investigators went through Nikki's case file from the very beginning to end. After that, they located a group of 1,500 males, all of whom had ties to the region near the campsite where Nikki Verstappen was last seen. The individuals on the list were either camp employees, residents of the neighborhood, or officially charged sex offenders. But once again, they were out of luck. The police did not give up easily. They renewed their request for public assistance in 2017. They requested over 20,000 DNA samples in order to perform kinship analysis. By this, investigators would have more information about the killer's relatives, which would greatly reduce the scope of their search. In the long run, only 15,000 volunteers participated. However, the size of this DNA dragnet operation was unprecedented in Dutch history. Given that there was nothing more to be done, it was a long shot but also the last option. Bulk DNA sweeping is a significant project, and numerous ethical issues have been brought up in relation to it. Most people believe that cooperating was a no-brainer if they had nothing to conceal, and their DNA profile may help investigators identify the killer of a young child. Authorities sent mails to all the men requesting new DNA samples. Police would attempt to persuade them to assist if there were no answers from them by visiting them at home. One of the men, named Jos Brecht, who was supposed to provide a sample, did not show up. 2 police officers went to his house, but he wasn't there. The man, according to his relatives, traveled to France in February of 2012 and did not return. Jos Brecht's family reported him missing in April. He had vanished from his home and presumably ran away before the police could find him and extract his DNA. Authorities investigated this man's past to learn who he was because they had concerns about him. When Nikki Verstappen was killed, Jos Brecht was 35 years old. He resided in Simpelveld with his mother, which is about 12 miles from the campsite. He was a committed scout member and frequently served as a camp leader as well. He had also spent some years providing childcare in Brunson. He had once been involved in a case of sexual abuse of 2 10-year-old boys in 1985. Despite making a confession to the crime, he was not found guilty. He only got a 2-year probationary period, and his name was never added to the list of sex offenders. That was why he evaded detection when local police conducted a DNA search of all sex offenders. His name was never mentioned. On August 10, 1998, Jos Brecht was in the immediate area of Nikki's disappearance. Around midnight on Tuesday, August 11, 1998, police stopped him while he was cycling on a road close to the crime site. Few hours before he was seen by the police, Nikki Verstappen's corpse had just been discovered, and at the time the police saw Jos Brecht, Nikki's body was being transported from the campsite to Maastricht for the autopsy. When the cops questioned him about why he was out cycling at that time, Jos Brecht responded that he was delivering letters to scout members because it was too hot to have done so during the day. The explanation seemed reasonable to the officers because that particular day had been very hot. However, when he was questioned later during investigation, he provided a different explanation. Child pornography was discovered on his personal computer in August 1998, the same month when Nikki Verstappen was murdered, but once again, Jos Brecht only got a warning. One of the 15,000 DNA samples provided to authorities during the bulk DNA search in 2017 revealed a close match to the foreign DNA found on Nikki Verstappen. The DNA sample belonged to a relative of the individual whose DNA was found on Nikki's clothes. That person happened to be related to the missing Jos Brecht. In order to create a DNA profile, police asked Jos Brecht's family if he had left behind a hairbrush or toothbrush as they were getting closer to solving the case. His family assisted the authorities and provided them with some of his personal belongings. Finally, after 20 painful long years, all the effort paid off. At the start June 2018, the forensics discovered a 100 perfect match between Jos Brecht Dedner and the DNA found on Nikki's pajamas and underpants. Detectives were, however, requested to keep the new information to themselves in order to avoid alerting the offender. The investigators now began a massive global search for Jos Brecht. Jos Brecht's last known location was in the Vosges mountain region of northern France, where he served as a survival expert who guided nature expeditions into the mountains. Keep in mind that he was an experienced scout member who knew what he was doing. When Jos Brecht departed the Vosges, no one knew where he had gone because he had not used his credit cards or his phone. Police discovered that he had improved his survival skills and had made preparations to vanish and live off the grid. His computer search history demonstrated that he was well prepared because he had done extensive study on small towns throughout Europe, places where Dutch news would not be reported. According to law enforcement, the only way to get him out of his hiding spot was to ask the public for assistance. On August 22, 2018, they revealed at a press conference that DNA samples from Jos Brecht's personal items matched the DNA discovered on Nikki Verstappen's clothing. They also disclosed his name and current age. Due to privacy laws in the Netherlands and the rule that everyone is considered innocent until proven guilty, it is customary to only use the first letter of a surname. However, this instance was unique because it required assistance from law officials to find Jos Brecht. The public appeal worked because the week following the press conference, A Dutch resident of northern Spain who had seen Jos Brecht's picture in the newspaper recognized him and called the police to report his whereabouts. Jos Brecht was living in a tent next to a commune house in the village of Castelltercal, north of Barcelona. 20 years after Nikki Verstappen's death, on August 26, 2018, Jos Brecht was taken into custody. The passport he had with him at the time of his arrest served as proof of his name. He was returned to the Netherlands on September 6, 2018, and appeared in court for the first time in December 2018. Peter de Vries rejoiced with Nikki Verstappen's family following the arrest of Jos Brecht. There was a strong feeling of relief and accomplishment. Jos Brecht had been questioned in February 2001 regarding his presence close to the crime scene on the night Nikki's body was discovered, and he had confessed to child molestation in the past. In his words, he said, "Yes, I can imagine why you'd want to speak to me because I have had some brushes with the law in the past in connection with child abuse." This statement was not followed up on or a DNA sample taken. Jos Brecht was not on the sex offenders list, but he had effectively placed himself on it. This case would have been long solved if only the police had thoroughly looked into Jos Brecht back then. In December 2018, the trial commenced in Maastricht. Jos Brecht was charged with manslaughter rather than murder. Manslaughter is a less serious charge. There isn't enough evidence to prove that the murder was premeditated, as there would be in a murder case. Jos Brecht pled not guilty in court and defended himself, saying his DNA was found on Nikki's clothing because when he was walking close to the edge of a forest back at the camp area, he saw something in the distance and went to look out of curiosity, only for him to find Nikki's body. He said that he had checked for signs of life, brushed leaves off the body, and then left without any other action because of his previous convictions. However, the prosecutor argued that a total of 27 traces of Jos Brecht's DNA had been found on Nikki's body, including on his underwear. Jos Brecht still maintained his innocence, saying he had no idea how his DNA ended up on Nikki's underwear. Nikki's underwear. After trial, Jos Brecht was found guilty, and on the January 28, 2022, an appeal court convicted him on a charge of manslaughter and sentenced him to 16 years imprisonment. Will Nikki Verstappen's family ever find satisfaction? Even though they may have some answers, their son will always be 11 years old, even as his peers age and progress through life. Every day, they are plagued by countless unanswered questions, such as, would Nike have grown up to realize his goal of playing professional soccer? They are wounded and they no longer believe in people. Femke Verstappen continues her mother's custom of lighting a candle for Nikki each day and keeping fresh flowers around the house, even though she is an adult with a kid of her own. The seaside town of Rothesay on the Isle of Bute is a picturesque place to live or visit. Located off the Scottish coast, it has a population of just over 4,500 people and is popular with tourists, holidaymakers, and families alike. It's frequently voted a beautiful place to visit with some extraordinary scenery, and there is a wonderful sense of community spirit. Everyone knows each other, and people often leave their doors unlocked. However, the safety and security of this tight-knit community would be shattered one summer night in February 2018. Felicia McFale was born on October 22, 2011, to parents Georgina and Robert. Although her parents had separated when she was a baby, she remained their absolute priority, and they both doted on her. She was bright, inquisitive, and loved being around people. She was described by her teacher as someone who loved to learn and always took great pride in her own work. Alicia was very friendly and welcomed everyone first thing in the morning at Breakfast Club. She was a considerate child who loved being part of a group, and she was popular with all the other children. Her mother Georgina lived in North Lanarkshire with Alicia's younger sister Courtney, and her father Robert lived on the Isle of Bute with his parents. The island is where Alicia would frequently spend time. Her parents ensured that she would see as much as she could of Robert and his parents too. She would spend every other weekend on the island, and in the February, she made a trip over there to start her summer holidays. On the evening of July 1st at around 11 p.m., Toni McLaughlin, who was the girlfriend of Alicia's father Robert, said she checked on Alicia and saw that she was sound asleep in her bed. Knowing this, she too called it a night and headed to bed herself. As this community was small and close-knit, the key was left in the front door. While Tony was checking on Alicia, a teenage boy named Aaron Campbell was in the midst of a house party, getting drunk and celebrating the end of his exams. 16-year-old Aaron also lived on the island, having moved there at a young age from England with his parents, Jeanette and Christopher, and his younger sister. He would describe his home life as difficult. He claimed he frequently argued and fought with his mother, and alleged that she drank heavily. His father was often absent due to his line of work. However, people that know the family disagree and say that both parents were very kind and loving. Aaron Campbell, on the surface, was a popular and seemingly charismatic young man. He even had his own YouTube channel. He documented various things about his life, including his sporting activities. As he got older, he began dabbling with drugs and alcohol and having darker and more extreme thoughts and impulses, such as fantasizing about rape. And he even went as far to say he might kill one day for the lifetime experience. He had a history of self-harming and depression, and was even entered into a rehabilitation program for starting fires. The party was being held at Campbell's house, and as it continued into the early hours of the morning, his behavior began to change. It resulted in him having an argument with his mother, telling people he felt suicidal, and saying he just wanted to get stoned. Using Facebook Messenger, Campbell tried to contact Tony attempting to buy drugs. According to the Facebook messages, there had recently been a falling out between Robert McFale and Aaron, with Aaron alleging the quality of the cannabis wasn't good enough. Failing to get hold of Tony, he decided to head to their house, which was only a few minutes walk away. With him, he took a kitchen knife. As Alicia's grandfather, Callum, woke up for work at 6 a.m., he went to check on his granddaughter, but found her bed empty. He immediately alerted Robert and Tony, who subsequently contacted the police. Upon checking her phone, Tony saw the missed calls and messages from Campbell and attempted to call him back. He messaged her back saying it didn't matter anymore with several laughing emojis. She quickly told him that Alicia had gone missing, and he replied, "Oh damn, I'm sure she's not went too far." Later that day, Aaron was sent to Snapchat out to his friends with the caption, "Found the guy that done it." It's not uncommon for communities to band together when cases like these arise, and Rothsay was no exception. A huge manhunt began. Members of the public, a helicopter, and the Coast Guard joined the search, and pleas for more help were sent out via Facebook. Shortly after the search began, they found what they were looking for. At around 9 a.m., the police were called as a local man had discovered Alicia's lifeless and naked body in a wooded area about 15 minutes from her home. Tragically, her mother Georgina would find this out via Facebook. The autopsy concluded that Alicia had sustained 17 injuries, and the pathologist would refer to these injuries as catastrophic. On the July 21st, Alicia's funeral was held with hundreds of mourners in attendance. One of the people grieving the loss of Alicia, and who was involved in the initial search for her, was Jeanette Campbell, Aaron's mother. Looking for answers and anything she could do to help, she decided to check her CCTV cameras installed outside her home in the hopes of picking anything up. Upon looking at the footage, her heart dropped. She watched her own son entering and leaving the house twice around the hours Alicia was believed to have gone missing. After asking him about this, she decided to turn the footage into the police as a way of eliminating Aaron. The police brought Aaron Campbell in for questioning as a witness, but he remained calm and collected, showing no signs of any wrongdoing. He told them he was simply heading out to buy cannabis. As part of the interview process, the police looked into Campbell's phone, which began to show the true, horrifying picture. They uncovered the Snapchat he had sent out, the Facebook messages to Tony, and evidence that he had been Googling how DNA would be uncovered at a crime scene. Following these discoveries, they would match Aaron's DNA to the DNA found on Alicia's body. The chances of it being anybody else were more than 1,000,000,000 to 1. He was swiftly arrested on suspicion of murder and charged the following day. First, he answered no comments, but later he would claim that he and Tony had been pursuing an affair, and that after having sex in the garage that evening, she had saved the condom and planted his DNA at the murder scene. After more interrogations, the horror initially he claimed to steal drugs. However, he found 6-year-old Alicia asleep. He would later tell a psychologist that once he saw her, all he thought about was killing her, referring to it as a moment of opportunity. He picked her up and left. Alicia began to wake up after a short time and asked him what was happening. He told her he was a friend of her father's, and even gave her his t-shirt to keep her warm. The events that transpired are nothing short of horrific. Alicia was raped and brutally murdered. Campbell then threw her clothes into the sea and dumped her naked body in the woodlands before heading home to have a shower and clean off any evidence. He returned to the murder scene a short while later to retrieve his phone. When it came time for him to enter his plea, Aaron Campbell pleaded not guilty. The trial began in February 2019 with Judge Lord Matthews presiding. Campbell's behavior would shock the courtroom. His lack of remorse showed as he struggled not to laugh as the evidence was being presented. He would eventually say he was quite satisfied with the murder and appeared to revel and take pride in what he had done. Following a conversation with a psychologist, Aaron Campbell would finally admit to everything shortly before his sentencing. The trial lasted 9 days, and the jury took just 3 hours to find him unanimously guilty on all counts. Aaron showed no emotion as the jury fed back their verdict. Because he was under the age of 18 at the time he was found guilty, his name and images were not printed. Media outlets argued it was in the public interest to know, and as a result, for the first time in Scottish criminal history, Judge Lord Matthews agreed to reverse the naming restriction. On the March 21, 2019, Aaron Thomas Campbell was sentenced to 27 years in prison for the abduction, rape, and murder of Alicia McFale. This sentence would later be reduced by 3 years after Campbell made a successful appeal. Upon sentencing, Judge Lord Matthews described Campbell's arrogance and callousness as breathtaking, and spoke of the profound effect the crime had had on the island's community. Since his sentencing, Aaron Campbell has been disowned by his family, and police officers and detectives have warned that he bears such a threat to society, he should never be released. However, should he be released at the end of his sentence, he will be just 40 years old. Almost a year after her death in a huge public donation, Alicia's memory was honored by her old primary school. They built a large wooden playhouse decorated with unicorns and butterflies. They said it was inspired by how much Alicia loved her friends and loved talking to people. They wanted to create a safe space for children to be together and make friends. The murder of Alicia McFale was a crime that shook the United Kingdom, and her family and friends are determined that she will never be forgotten. Lena Reyes Gages was born on the August 26, 1960 in a small town in Mexico. She had ambitions to pursue greater things in life. Lena was an accomplished ballerina and, with a degree in international business, she had hopes of breaking into the business world to become one of the greatest business tycoons across national boundaries. Her love for international business influenced her choice for a life partner. Growing up, she wanted to share her life with someone who would love her just as much as she does him, and also, she wanted someone who sailed the same career ship as her. In 1996, 35-year-old Lena Reyes Gages left her native town in Mexico to the United States in search of greener pastures and hopefully to get to meet people who shared the same business mindset as hers. While learning and developing her skills, she waited for her right type of man. That same year, in 1996, she met Edward Geddes in New Mexico. Edward Geddes was 25 years her senior and was everything Lena Reyes wanted in a man. Aside from his appealing physical qualities, he was a business owner and knew the in and out of the business world. Lena Reyes at that point fell in love with Edward and felt she could eventually have the future she had always wanted. They started dating, and 6 months into their relationship, they got married and moved into an apartment in Youngstown, Ohio. Although, it is unclear what she did after this and whether she was able to keep up with her career. 2 years later, on the April 8, 1998, Lena Reyes Gages had planned to travel back to Mexico to visit her family, with the journey taking her via Texas by plane. Lena prepared for her journey as she supposedly packed a blue sleeping bag as a gift for her young cousin before leaving. However, the day ended and Lena Reyes Gages never arrived to Mexico, and no trace of her could be found. Her relatives in Mexico were frantic with worry when her flight never arrived at Mexico. As days, weeks, and months passed by, the Reyes family still could not get a hold of Lena Reyes Gages. When they contacted Edward Geddes to know what had happened to his wife, he said he had not seen her since she left on the April 8, 1998 to visit them in Mexico. Her family became worried and had a feeling that something was wrong because it was unlike Lena to vanish with no trace. They then called the police in Ohio to report their daughter and sister missing. Edward Geddes, on the other hand, initially failed to file a missing person report until 6 months later in October of 1998. Did he inform the police that his wife was missing? The first suspect in the case was Edward Geddes. He was brought in for questioning by the Youngstown police in October 1998. When he was asked about his missing wife, Edward Geddes told the state investigators that he last saw her when he dropped her off at the airport in Pittsburgh. He said Lena Reyes carried a suitcase, a cosmetic case, and a blue sleeping bag that he said was supposed to be a gift for her young cousin. He mentioned to the investigators that he kissed his wife goodbye outside the airport, and that was the last time he saw her. With no evidence pinning him to Lena Reyes Geddes' disappearance, the police struck out Edward Geddes as a suspect. Authorities in Ohio did all they could to find Lena Reyes, but no leads were ever found and the case slowly dwindled and went cold. Meanwhile, on April 20, 1998, in Garfield County, Utah, a civilian passing through State Route 276 mile Posthumed stumbled upon something suspicious at the Maiden Water Spring near Lake Powell and Tickaboo. They stopped and walked over to the odd-looking item and soon realized it was a large bundle, roughly the length and dimensions of a human body, which had been discarded just off the side of the road. At that point, the passerby contacted the local Garfield County Sheriff's Department, and within minutes, officers were quickly dispatched to the scene. The officers approached the bundle and noticed whatever was inside was wrapped in a children's rug, which had a design of houses and roadways on which children could play. They then began to unroll the large rug and soon discovered a sleeping bag inside. Inside the sleeping bag was a patchwork of various plastic trash bags secured with duct tape and bound with rope. Everyone at the scene had a bad feeling about what they were about to discover as the investigators gradually cut away and peeled off the layers of tape and plastic. When the last layer came off, investigators got a shocking discovery. Lying in the discarded bundle was the body of a woman who had wounds which indicated that she had died as a result of a gunshot to the head. The woman was described as having multiple dental restorations, freckles on her face, tattooed eyebrows, and several moles, which included a unique mole on her right ear. Though her face was still identifiable, her fingers had been chopped off in what is thought to have been an attempt to hide her identity by the perpetrator. The autopsy done on her revealed that the cause of her death was as a result of the gunshot wound she had suffered. In a bid to identify her, her statistics were imputed into online databases, which described her as Hispanic or Native American with dark eyes, dark shoulder-length hair, and a freckled complexion, but no missing persons reports in the state matched her description. Despite all efforts made to identify her, nobody came forward, and she became another Jane Doe who was dubbed the Maiden Water victim after the natural spring by which she had been found. With no leads, the case went cold. In the year 2018, the Utah State Bureau of Investigation decided to appeal to the public for leads when they carried out a cold case review of the Maiden Water victim. They took the unusual step of publishing post-mortem photos of the Maiden Water victim, including a photo of the unique mole inside the arch of her right ear. That same week, police in Youngstown, Ohio, who were updating their missing persons cases, obtained a photo of Lena Reyes Geddes from the United States Department of Homeland Security. They then released the photo to the public. Days later, a woman in California who was a true crime fan and an amateur sleuth got in touch with authorities in Utah to say that she had seen a missing person cold case in Ohio in which the victims seemed to look similar. The true crime fan had noted the mole on the upper arch of the Maiden Water victim's ear. In the Ohio's published photo of Lena Reyes Geddes, a mole was visible in the same spot. After the Ohio and Utah authorities were made aware of this, they followed the tip and discovered that Lena Reyes Geddes and the Maiden Water victim weren't just similar but were one and the same. Authorities from Utah and Ohio then put out new information in Texas, hoping to find Lena Reyes Geddes' family members. Luckily, Lena Reyes Geddes' sister, Lucero Reyes, who was just 11 years old when Lena disappeared, called the authorities to inform them that Lena Reyes Geddes was her sister. In order to ascertain that fact, provision was made for Lucero Reyes, who traveled over 300 miles to Monterey, to the United States consulate nearest to the family's home in San Luis Potosí, so that authorities could obtain a sample of her DNA. After the DNA testing was done, the maiden water Jane Doe was confirmed to be her missing sister. Now that the detectives knew who and where Lena Reyes Geddes was, they started an investigation to find out who killed her. Initially, the officials with the Utah Department of Public Safety wondered if she had been murdered by Scott Kimball, a convicted serial killer at the time who is still serving a 70-year sentence imposed by the state of Colorado after killing 4 people, including his uncle between February 2003 and February 2004. 3 of his victims were found in remote areas of Colorado and Utah, and there seemed to be a number of similarities between how his victims were killed and found and how Lena Reyes was. For instance, the cause of Lena's death matched that of Scott Kimball's victims, and Scott Kimball had also discarded bodies by wrapping them up. One time, Scott Kimball had tied one of his victims' hands with a complex knot system that matched Lena's crime scene. He had also previously used a child's play mat to dispose off a body. Scott Kimball's former wife and son had made statements alleging they saw and purchased a rug similar to the one used to wrap Lena Reyes Geddes' body. The detectives were piecing obvious facts together and were at the verge of unraveling the mystery behind Lena Reyes' death. A warrant for his DNA was then filed in Logan County, where Scott Kimball told Colorado investigators that he had killed 21 people, explaining that one of them was a hitchhiker on a bridge near Haight, Utah, in 1998 or 1999. Haight, Utah was about 10 miles from the recovery site of Lena Reyes Geddes. Scott Kimball said he had been at a family reunion in Bryce Canyon, Utah, around the time of the murder. Detectives were hopeful that Scott Kimball could actually be Lena Reyes Geddes' killer. However, their hopes were quickly dashed when they interviewed Scott for over 2 hours and realized he did not know anything about the crime scene where Lena Reyes Geddes was found. The detectives, who were disappointed, were forced to rule him out as a suspect when his DNA didn't match with the one at the crime scene. The investigators then concluded that the glaring similarities between his victims and Lena Reyes Geddes were merely coincidences. After Lena Reyes Geddes was identified, people who knew her and her husband in Ohio came forward with some tips that suggested Edward Geddes as the murderer. In February 2019, investigators decided to try the new techniques in DNA analysis which were making headlines at the time, following the eventual solving of the Golden State Killer case. The West Jordan Police Department then used an MVAC, a device similar to a shop vac, to extract genetic evidence on the rope that had been used to bind Lena Reyes Geddes. During the genetic evidence extraction, 2 different genetic samples belonging to 2 different individuals were found on the rope. This caused confusion for a while until it was later realized that one of the DNA sample belonged to a knot expert who detectives consulted on the case. He had accidentally added his own DNA to the sample on the rope and contaminated it. Regardless, investigators were able to isolate another piece of genetic material that appeared to have belonged to Edward Geddes. Unfortunately, Edward Geddes had died by suicide in Nevada in February 2001, 3 years after Lena Reyes Geddes was murdered. It became impossible to directly compare his DNA to the one found at the crime scene because, after his death, he was cremated. However, in order to ascertain that the DNA sample found on the rope really belonged to Edward Geddes, a company called Pure Gold Forensics used familial DNA from 3 of his living relatives, one of them being his son. The DNA testing came out a match to the DNA found on the rope used to tie Lena Reyes Geddes. In 2022, the Utah State Bureau investigation then considered the Lena Reyes Geddes case solved and Edward Geddes to be the murderer. Unfortunately, he died by suicide, taking the question of why he killed his wife to his grave. It is no doubt that Edward Geddes went to a great extent to cover up his involvement in the crime and to ensure Lena Reyes Geddes' identity remained a mystery, seeing that he had cut off her fingers and traveled over 1,800 miles to dump her body in Utah where she had no ties. Some people speculate that Edward Geddes might have been a controlling man who often abused Lena Reyes Geddes and made her uncomfortable. This photograph of the two shows Lena looking uncomfortable while Edward Geddes could be seen grasping her firmly by the shoulders. The video of Edward Geddes' interview with the police in October of 1998 portrays a man whose only interest is to cover up his own involvement in his wife's disappearance. Like a pro, he discussed the sleeping bag she was taking on her trip as a gift for her cousin, the one in which he had already concealed her dead body. He often laughed as he tells the investigator how he secured the bag and wrapped it up tight for the journey. Furthermore, to portray himself as a loving, attentive, and caring husband, he had told the detectives that Lena Reyes Giddies was wearing one of his favorite underwear that morning when she left. Some reports say perhaps Lena Reyes Giddies was actually planning to leave Edward Giddies that day, on the April 8, 1998, concluding that the trip to Mexico was more than a simple visit to families. We all will probably never know, but thanks to DNA and an observant true crime fan, investigators and Lena Reyes Giddies' family finally have answers as to what happened to her 24 years ago. Following the resolve of the case, Agent Brian Davis from the Utah Department of Public Safety said, "To have this answered finally after 24 years is incredible. I know it's not the answer that Lena's sister would have wanted when she found her sister, but they had suspected. In fact, quite frankly, their family thought that Edward had done something to her. They just hadn't proved it." Lena Reyes Giddies' sister, Lucero Reyes, said, "I felt like for 20 years no one would listen to me, but now I know what happened. I'm here to bring her home, not like I expected, but I'm bringing her back home with me." Lee Oki was born on the August 21, 1979 to parents Donald Oki and Vicki Felton. Her parents had both served in the military, and after their divorce in 1981, Donald was relocated. He and his daughter enjoyed a close relationship and would visit each other whenever possible. While she was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, her and her mother eventually moved to Tupelo, Mississippi. In late August 1992, phenomenal rain and furious winds were raging throughout Tupelo. On the night of the 26th, Lee slept in her mother's bed due to her fear of storms. The following morning, they had breakfast together and discussed the day ahead of them. Lee was going to go to an open house at her middle school with her grandmother as the new semester hadn't yet started. Later that evening, Vicki and Lee were going to go out for a meal. Vicki left for work at around 7:30 a.m. This was a big step for her as it was the first time that 13-year-old Lee would be left alone at home. She'd only become a teenager the week before. When she arrived at work, Vicki heard on the news that Hurricane Andrew was heading their way, and so called the house to check on Lee. Lee never answered the phone. Panicking, Vicki tried again, but her call went unanswered. Knowing this was out of character for Lee, Vicki felt something was desperately wrong, and so left work at 8:30 a.m. and headed straight home to 105 Honey Locust Drive. Upon arriving at the house, she saw that the garage door was open and the light was on. The light in the garage would only activate within a few minutes of the door being opened. She also noticed that another door to the house was unlocked. As it was the first time that she had left her daughter alone, she had been sure to secure the house before she'd left. As panic began to set in, she went about searching the house for Lee. She called out Lee's name but was met with silence. When she went inside, she was confronted by a disturbing sight, a pool of blood on the floor with blood splattered up the wall. When she made it to Lee's room, she saw that her favorite blanket had been left in a crumpled heap on the floor. It was then that Vicki called 911. She frantically told police that she needed assistance. Her daughter was missing, and there was blood in the house. The police were quick to arrive on scene. They could find no evidence of a forced entry, leading investigators to believe that Lee could have opened the door to someone. Further searches of the house found even more blood. Along with the significant pool in the hallway, blood was also found in Lee's bedroom, the bathroom, and on her bedroom door. The blood was still wet, and the splatter pattern and hair strands on the door frame were consistent with a significant head injury to someone around 5 foot. Lee was 4'10". The blood in the bathroom led investigators to believe that whoever had been at the house that morning had made an attempt to clean up. Based on the evidence stacking up in front of them, the police believed that Lee had been murdered inside the home. Upon searching her bedroom, Vicki told police that several notable items were missing, including Lee's shoes, some underwear, a sleeping bag, and her glasses. In the laundry basket, they found her blood-stained nightgown, meaning that Lee must have been wearing something else when she either left or was taken from the house. In charge of the investigation was Tupelo Police Chief Bardaguerre, and he knew that the nightgown provided a vital insight into what could have happened to Lee. He said, because it looked like the blood had dripped down onto her nightgown, You would think that the injury had to be above the neck possibly. The police quickly mobilized and formed search teams throughout Tupelo in a desperate bid to find Lee. They had their description of her: 4'10", 95 pounds, with blonde hair and hazel eyes. The police trawled through the woodlands and the surrounding areas, but they could find no trace of her. Due to the weather, search dogs were unable to pick up a scent. While it is now the backbone of most police investigations, in the early 1990s, DNA testing was still in its infancy, so the police had to use blood typing. The investigators were able to determine that the blood was type O. Interviews were conducted with people throughout Tupelo. Family, friends, classmates, neighbors, and teachers were all questioned, but the police still had no credible leads. Rick Hammond, who wrote for the Daily Journal as a crime reporter, said the first few days it was very frenzied in terms of trying to find out if she might be alive somewhere and injured, looking for places she might have been hidden, injured, lost. Her father, Donald, who had been stationed out of state in Virginia at the time of her disappearance, could not contain his rage. This coward must have really felt like a tough man or woman to beat a little girl to death. Often, I cannot help but think of how horrified Lee must have been while this piece of garbage beat her to death and watch her bleed out in the hall. The small city of Tupelo was suddenly at the center of a media firestorm. The place famous for being the hometown of Elvis Presley was now famous again, but this time for a much more sinister reason. It was the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. It had a strong sense of community, and it was a place that people were proud to call their home. Rick Hammond said that the people of Tupelo wanted some sort of reassurance that this wasn't a stranger smart, sweet little girl. She was a daddy's kid like all little girls are. She liked to be hugged. She liked pizza. She liked dogs. This idyllic city had suddenly been turned upside down with the disappearance of one of their own. Everyone knew a girl like Lee. A week after her disappearance, a worker in McDonald's said they had seen a girl in the drive-thru that bore a resemblance to Lee. The police were quick to pursue it. However, this would prove to be a false alarm. Rumors also began to swirl around Vicky's ex-boyfriend, Barney Yarbrough. He and Vicky had recently caught an end to their relationship, and Barney had allegedly been abusive towards Lee. There were also reports that Lee had arrived at school with a black eye and bruises, but this was not corroborated. He was immediately pulled in for questioning by investigators. However, he was able to provide a substantiated alibi, and he passed a polygraph test. The police were back at square one. On September 9th, 2 weeks after Lee vanished from her home, a package arrived at the house. It was an 8-inch envelope addressed to Barney Yarbrough, Vicky's ex-boyfriend, and the return address was the same as the mailing address. In it, Willie's glasses that had been taken from the house on the day she disappeared. The postmark showed it had been sent from nearby Boonville. After this, the FBI were drafted in to help with the investigation. It was sent to the state crime lab in Jackson for analysis of the handwriting and the DNA. They tried to extract DNA from the stamps on the envelope, but whoever had sent it had used water instead of saliva. The police chief believed that the glasses had been mailed in an attempt to divert the investigation. Donald was told by several locals to look more closely at Vicky. He commented saying, "I was already doing that. I don't know if her mother was involved." The police too would soon turn their attention to Vicky. As part of the investigation, she was given 3 separate polygraph tests, 1 with the Tupelo police and 2 with the FBI. Upon analyzing the results, independent examiners stated that she had shown signs of deception in every single test. The police chief said in February 2017, "You still can't eliminate her. There are still too many unanswered questions for Vicky, and I don't know if that is unusual for somebody to go off to work and say, well, I just left Lee, but I'm going to call and check on her. Why check on her that soon after she just left her?" In a February 2012 interview with the Daily Journal, Vicky said that Lee would never have opened the door to a stranger. So anyone Lee could have let in must have been someone she recognized and trusted. The person who she suspects is involved with her daughter's disappearance lived just a mile away from them, was a Bible school teacher, and shared Lee's passion for horses at the stables just off North Thomas Street, a man called Oscar McKinley Kearns. 9 months after Lee vanished from her home, Kearns abducted a girl he met through a church in Tupelo. She was alone at her house at around 7 a.m. when he arrived under the guise of taking her to school. Instead, He drove her to a secluded area in DeSoto County and subjected her to a horrific and prolonged sexual assault. He then drove her to school where she reported him to the police. He was convicted and sentenced to 24 years in prison, suspended for 16. After serving less than 4 years in custody, he was freed. He was again convicted 1999 for kidnapping a couple and sexually assaulting the woman. On November 9, 1993, the Clarion Ledger reported that a skull had been found in a ditch in Monroe County and that it had been identified as Lee. A few days later, this was retracted. After further testing, it was revealed to be the remains of Pollyanna Sue Keith, who had gone missing in March of that year. In February 2009, Lee's mother, Vicky, said that she did not accept anything for sure, and until a body was found, she would remain hopeful that Lee is alive. Despite the suspicious circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Lee O'Brien, no trace of her has ever been found. Her father Donald said, "I don't know if we will ever find out what happened. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Lee O'Brien, then please contact either the Crime Stoppers of Northeast Mississippi, the Tupelo Police Department, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Laurel Jean Mitchell was born on May 24, 1958 to Richard Dick Mitchell and Wilma Mae Mitchell in Whitley County, Indiana. At the time of Laurel's murder, Dick Mitchell was a well-known public figure in North Webster. He was a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. On the other hand, Laurel's mother, Wilma Mitchell, operated the North Webster Food Pantry at Og's Burgers for several years. Apart from Laurel, Dick and Wilmer had 2 more children named Bruce and Sarah, who were 18 and 12 respectively. Laurel and her siblings had a tight-knit bond despite the occasional siblings' rivalry. Laurel grew up to become a loved personality in North Webster. Her friendly nature and heartwarming smile won over the hearts of everyone she met. She often went out of her way to make other people around her happy and feel loved. Laurel had many talents, in which one of them was her love for singing. This made her join the local church choir. Her love for music did not stop there. She was a good dancer who brushed up her skills by taking dance lessons at a local studio. She found a sense of accomplishment in singing and dancing. By the age of 17, Laurel Mitchell was set to begin her senior year in Wawasee High School. Before the school year began, she decided to take up a job at the Cokeysbury Inn, a small restaurant in Epworth Forest, located on the shores of Webster Lake. For her, taking up a job at the restaurant means having the opportunity to gather experience and add value to her life while she makes a couple of extra bucks. On the August 6, 1975, the Mitchells family started their day unaware that a tragedy awaits them by the end of the day. Laurel, Sarah, and a friend of Laurel, who stays with them, woke up to tackle their morning chores. Bruce, the oldest child and the only son, was not around at the time because he was already married and was serving in the Army in California. Dick and Wilmer got ready for work and bade their daughters goodbye as they headed out to their respective workplace. Later that afternoon, Laurel, who was on a night shift, also headed to work with plans of meeting up with her friends at Adventureland when her shift was over. Oftentimes when she works the night shift, either her mom or dad would pick her up after work. But on the August 6, 1975, since she had plans to meet up with her friends, she didn't see the need for her parents to come pick her up. Around 10 p.m., Laurel Mitchell began to wrap up her work for the day, and at exactly 10:15 p.m., she left her workplace and headed out to Adventureland, a once popular amusement park about half a mile away from the restaurant where she worked. On her way there, she passed by a classmate who waved at her as she walked by the entrance to the Epworth Forest. And that appeared to have been the last time Laurel was seen alive. She never made it to Adventureland. Neither her friends nor family knew she was missing or in danger. Her parents believed she was with her friends at Adventureland, when in reality, her friends for some reason had changed location and gone to the county fair that evening. Thinking that Laurel had just gone home after work, the midnight curfew for the Mitchells family passed, and Laurel's family became worried because Laurel had not come back home. They waited through the night, checking the door to see if she would walk in, but Laurel never did. In the early hours of August 7, 1975, at exactly 4:16 a.m., Dick and Wilma Mitchell called the police to report their daughter missing. Neighbors, friends, and the police started out for a search, but Laurel couldn't be found in all the areas they looked for her. However, few hours later, at around 10:30 a.m., a man named Glenn Dixon and his son, Hager Dixon, were about to start fishing in the Elkhart River near Diamond Lake Road Bridge in Noble County when they found a dead body floating in the water. The police were called to the crime scene and the body was quickly identified to be Laurel Mitchell. The news of Laurel's death shattered her family and the whole community of North Webster, who saw Laurel as a kind, decent, and beautiful person. Laurel was described as smart, boisterous, and motherly, often doting on the neighborhood children. Due to her involvement in the local church choir group, dance classes, and other community events, she was a well-known face in the small town of North Webster. And this was why residents in North Webster were shocked. They wondered who could kill such a sweet girl who wouldn't hurt a fly. On the day Laurel's body was discovered, Dr. Peel Sankey from the Goshen General Hospital in Goshen, Elkhart County, Indiana, performed an autopsy on her. The cause of Laurel's death was determined to be drowning. She showed no obvious signs of trauma aside from several bruises on her hands and shoulder. She was said to have resisted her attacker, fighting for her life. When Laurel was discovered, she was fully clothed, however. The autopsy determined that she had been sexually assaulted. The police ruled the case to be homicide, and the search for Laurel's killer began. Indiana State Police, along with the Kosciuszko County Sheriff's Department, the Noble County Sheriff's Department, and the Noble County Coroner's Office, opened an investigation into Mitchell's death. Investigators spent thousands of hours trying to solve her murder. They followed every lead. They interviewed neighbors who lived around the crime scene. A woman named Catherine Flynn, who lived at the area at the time of Laurel's murder, told the police that around 10 p.m. on the August 6, 1975, that she heard a loud car turn around next door. She said she heard voices say, "Let's get her." Another resident with the name Frank Overmeyer told investigators he also heard a loud vehicle in the neighborhood, possibly an Oldsmobile. The police followed these leads and tried all they could, but the killer of Laurel could not be found. Over the next 5 decades, numerous detectives continued to work on her case. With no improved DNA technology in the 1970s, the Laurel Mitchell's case was gradually getting cold. After waiting for years to get answers, sadly, Dick and Wilmer Mitchell couldn't cheat nature as they passed away from natural causes at the age of 82 in 2012. However, despite the case growing colder by the day, Laurel's sister, Sarah Mitchell, never gave up hope of finding answers. Every year, she would appeal to the media to once again cover her sister's story and always maintain contact with Detective Kevin Smith, who was assigned to Laurel's case. During one of her chats with the detective, Sarah mentioned that a family friend had told her a small band from Delphi, Indiana, called Celebrate the Sun, consisting of several boys and girls around the ages of 16 to 20, had played a show that evening at the Cokesbury Inn and had left around the same time Laurel was last seen alive. The family friend also mentioned seeing the same group at the fire station later that evening. He described seeing a woman having a panic attack and hyperventilating outside of the fire station. He said the woman was accompanied by a group of guys, all around the ages of 16 to 20, who were trying to calm her down. The detective then told Sarah that this tip had never been reported and felt it was worth investigating. Investigators then tracked down the members of the band. It was, however, discovered that they were a performing church group who were not from Delphi and had never stopped at the fire station that evening. The case went cold again, but in June 2013, a year after Laurel's parents died, Renee Sexton, a Florida woman who was 16 years old and living in Noble County in 1975, contacted the county sheriff's department to inform them that she had gone on a date with a man called John Wayne Lefman, and as he was driving her back home, he admitted his involvement in a crime that he committed with his friend Fred Bandy. John Wayne Leafman had told the woman details that were consistent with the police findings when Laurel's body was found, including the anatomical findings from the autopsy results. In 2014, Bill McDonald, who was a high school sophomore at the time of Laurel's murder, told police that he socialized with a man named Fred Bandy while in high school, and that Fred Bandy told him after Laurel Mitchell's murder that he had committed the crime and also provided details of the location where her body was found. In 2019, another man told the police that he and Bill McDonald had attended a high school party with Fred Bandy, John Wayne Leafman, and others when Mitchell's murder came up. Fred Bandy then stated that he and John Wayne Leafman committed the crime of killing Laurel Mitchell together. These multiple confessions were what the investigators needed to pursue the case vigorously once again. After the last witness came forward with the same information, in 2019, Laurel Mitchell's clothes and other evidence preserved from the crime scene in 1975 were resubmitted for DNA testing at the Indiana State Police Laboratory. The forensics developed a profile for a possible suspect. 3 suspects, who were initially on the list of the investigators, were eliminated and attention was shifted to Fred Bandy for a buccal swab. On December 5, 2022, authorities visited Fred Bandy at his residence, explaining to him the reason they were there and asking for a sample of his DNA. Surprisingly, Fred Bandy did not put up a fight. He voluntarily provided the DNA sample. Fred Bandy's buccal swab was then taken to the lab for testing, and the results showed that Fred Bandy is more likely to be the contributor of the DNA found in Laurel Jane Mitchell's clothing than any other unknown person. A search warrant on Fred Bandy's home was issued, and during the search, investigators later discovered that Fred Bandy had a 1971 Oldsmobile in 1975. It is believed that the Oldsmobile was used by him and John Wayne Leafman to bring Mitchell to the Mallard Roost public access site in Noble County, where they forcibly removed her from the vehicle and deliberately drowned her. Additionally, information from the Indiana court database shows that Fred Bandy is a twice convicted child molester, deemed a sexually violent predator in Elkhart County. On Monday, February 6, 2023, 47 years and 6 months after her death, the Indiana State Police and the Noble County Sheriff's Department arrested Fred Bandy and John Wayne Leafman in their respective homes and charged them with the murder of Laurel G. Mitchell. Both suspects are being held in the Noble County Jail without bond. Following the arrest of Laurel's killers, her sister, Sarah Nicely Mitchell, said, "They basically blew up my family for a lot of years. It was rage. If I could have killed them myself, I would have. If they gave them the electric chair, I would have thrown the switch. I'm glad they are going to be punished, that they won't be able to hurt anyone else. But she's still dead." She remembered her sister and said, "She was just a good, kind, decent person. She was an awesome person. Wherever she went, she had to take me with her. That wasn't fun for her, but it was for me. She didn't deserve this. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." On October 17, 1952, Dennis and Daphne Frost welcomed their second daughter, Helen, into the world. 4 years after her birth, the family made a big life change and moved thousands of miles away from the United Kingdom to British Columbia, Canada. Sisters Helen and Sandy had a stable childhood. Their parents were devoted to each other and their children, and Sandy said that they were good parents despite their sometimes rebellious teenage girls. In 1969, Helen moved to Prince George, British Columbia, and she was joined in November by Sandy, a woman called Darlene, and Darlene's young baby. In the spring of 1970, Helen's life would be turned upside down as she fell pregnant. On the May 13th, she gave birth to a baby girl who she called Sandra. Sandra would soon be taken into government custody. Helen left the home for unwed mothers and returned to Prince George. Her relationship with Sandra's father, Stefan, fell apart, and she was unsuccessful in her attempt to regain custody of her daughter. According to her sister, she left the social worker's office in tears, and they never spoke about the incident again. Helen's personality was an interesting mix. On the one hand, she could be quiet, private, and introverted. On the other hand, she could be impulsive and spontaneous. Her and her sister would hitchhike with strangers, and Helen was comfortable with this kind of hasty behavior. On the October 13th, 1970, Helen was at home in her apartment on the 1600 block of Queensway in Prince George. Her sister Sandy came home at around 8 p.m., and Helen asked if she wanted to go for a walk with her. But Sandy said no, saying it was too cold. Around 20 minutes later, Helen said she would go for a quick walk by herself, and wearing her navy blue coat and blue trousers, she left. When Helen failed to return home that night, people were not immediately concerned. Her impulsive nature meant she could sometimes be gone without explanation. However, as time passed, her sister began to worry, and on the October 15th, 2 days later, she was reported as a missing person. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, also known as the Mounties, were tasked with investigating Helen's disappearance. When she left to go for her walk, she left behind her clothes, money, and ID. The police had their description: around 5'5", about 125 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes with a right eye that drooped ever so slightly. The police soon received a tip that Helen had been hitchhiking from the Husky gas station in Prince George, but they could find no evidence of this. And before long, the trail had gone cold. Every lead would prove to be one dead end after another. One theory that was quickly ruled out was that Helen had been injured or died in a tragic accident. The police could find no evidence that she had been involved in any kind of accident. Investigators were quick to look at the possibility that Helen had run away. She had a history of hitchhiking and disappearing. However, her sister Sandy did not agree with this argument. She said that Helen had left her money, ID, clothes, other personal items, and had initially invited Sandy to go with her. The tough circumstances that Helen found herself going through at the time she went missing also led the Mounties to examine the possibility of suicide. Having recently lost custody of her own daughter and then living with Darlene and Darlene's young child could have been too much for Helen to bear. The difficulty she was facing could have led her to take her own life. Sandy also dismissed this theory, saying there was no evidence of a suicide, she hadn't left a suicide note, and she didn't seem out of character. There was speculation as to whether or not Helen had met a friend after she left her Prince George apartment, and they were quick to interview her ex-boyfriend, Stefan. After numerous interrogations, they deemed him not to be suspicious. Sandy said she had discovered a tip that Helen had possibly hitchhiked with a trucker. However, the police have not confirmed this. Highway 16 is an important part of the Yellowhead Highway. It's 450 miles long and stretches between Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia, Canada. It's perhaps more commonly known as the Highway of Tears. It's been the site of numerous unsolved murders and disappearances, starting in 1970, with a disproportionately high number of the victims being Indigenous women. To investigate these unsolved crimes, the Mounties set up Project Ipana. The number of victims varies. The official list from the Mounties has it at no more than 18. However, Aboriginal and Indigenous organizations say that the number of women who have been murdered or gone missing on the Highway of Tears could be over 40. Chronologically, Helen Frost was the first woman to go missing on the Highway of Tears. Helen's family have fought tirelessly to have her name added to the Ipana victims list, and despite the pleas of her family, the Mounties denied their request. They said she did not meet the criteria for being a victim on the e-panel list. May 30th, 1974. The skeletonized remains of a woman are found wrapped up in a blanket buried in a shallow grave. The police theorized that the Jane Doe had died alongside a bank robber called Gustavos Lee Carmichael, who was most likely her boyfriend. They believe they had been murdered around December 31st, 1970, and this fits in with the plausible dates of Helen's timeline after she disappeared. The Jane Doe found in the shallow grave used the alias of Lorraine Stahl, and 2 people were convicted for the murders of her and Carmichael. Richard DeFreitas and Donald Brandt's motive was that Jane criminal behavior and activity. In the months leading up to her death, Jane Doe made several phone calls to states on the eastern seaboard, and she was known to drive a 1964 green Oldsmobile, which had either Maine or Massachusetts plates. The vehicle was later found dumped in Connecticut with a Maine inspection sticker. After speaking to people who interacted with Jane Doe, the police drew up a composite sketch, which bore a resemblance to Helen Frost. Despite the similarities, the items that were found on the New London County Jane Doe were not seen with Helen on or around the time of her disappearance, including an almond-shaped ring with JHSN inscribed in it, a set of hair rollers, and a yellow raincoat. As of June 5, 2020, the Connecticut State Police and the Mounties are actively working to determine if the New London County Jane Doe is indeed Helen Frost. Tragically, on the July 20, 2014, Dennis Frost passed away without finding out what had happened to his beloved daughter. Her sister Sandy has never given up hope, and she has been the driving force behind the search for her sister Helen. In February 2018, Helen's daughter Sandra reached out to Sandy after embarking on a search to find her birth mother, and the two were eventually reunited. Despite the suspicious circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Helen Frost, no trace of her has ever been found. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Helen Frost, then please contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And if you have any information relating to the identity of the New London County Jane Doe, then please contact the Connecticut State Police. In 1995, Mark Winger, a nuclear power plant technician in Springfield, Illinois, murdered his wife by beating her to death with a hammer. In an even darker twist to the story, he framed someone else for the murder, married their child's nanny shortly afterwards, and got away with murder for nearly 4 years. So how did he do it? Hi, and welcome to Mysterious 7. I'm Michael, and today I'm going to take you guys through another case with the most insane twists you've ever heard. In June of 1995, it seemed like life couldn't possibly get any better for Mark and Donna Winger. The nuclear technician and his wife had been happily married for several years, and they had just adopted a newborn baby girl named Bailey. Donna was the oldest of 3 sisters in what they described as an incredibly close-knit family. The Dreschers grew to love Mark too. He was smart, Jewish. He was attractive, and he was fun. Donna's sister, Jenny Levin, told the media, Donna just felt like she had found her person. After Mark and Donna Winger were married in 1989, he was offered a job, and the newlyweds settled in Springfield, Illinois. We always joked about the fact when one sister marries, that husband marries 3 sisters, Levin said. We shared our lives with Mark. Donna was working as an operating room technician, and Mark was a nuclear engineer. Donna couldn't have been happier. The only thing she would have liked to was to have a child, her stepfather Ira Drescher said. Donna's mother, Sarah Jane Drescher, said her daughter was overwhelmed when she learned that she could not get pregnant. But then one day while working at the hospital, a doctor told Donna that a teenager was looking to put her baby up for adoption. Adopting the child was an easy decision for her. She looked at me with tears when she said, Michelle, I knew at the minute they put the baby into my arms. She has always been mine, Donna's sister Michelle Hansen said. The Wingers welcomed baby Bailey into their home on June 1, 1995. Donna's family said the couple loved their new roles as parents. They seemed to have all the makings of a long and happy life together. Mark was just as excited to become a dad as Donna was to become a mom, Hansen said. Donna had met the woman who would eventually become her best friend, Diane Schultz, at the hospital. And with the arrival of Bailey, the two bonded over motherhood. But then everything turned dark. In August 1995, Donna took baby Bailey on a trip to Hollywood, Florida, to visit Donna's family. Her mother had just dropped the 2 of them off at the airport and hired a driver to pick them up in St. Louis, Missouri, and drive them back to Springfield. So after the visit, the 2 flew into St. Louis Airport and hopped in a cab driven by Roger Harrington with a 2-hour ride back to Springfield. During the course of the drive, Harrington reportedly began flirting with Donna and talking about drugs and orgies. Detective Charlie Cox, a police officer who investigated Donna's death, later said, this gentleman started opening up to Donna about issues he was having. He had a voice in his head named Dom. Dom would tell him to do bad things. Recently, Dom was telling him to hurt people. After Donna safely arrived home with Bailey, she called the transit company to make a formal complaint about Harrington's behavior, and the driver was suspended. Cox later said that the driver started flirting with Donna, telling her he liked older women and even invited her to attend what he described as one of his sex parties. Donna had told her family that the ride was terrifying because he was driving erratically at 75 miles per hour. After the harrowing ride, Donna had been the victim of some strange phone calls, Weinhoff said. The family had believed that the driver had been stalking her and was a danger. Donna called the limousine company to file a complaint, and Harrington was suspended. Mark argued his wife to write down the story in case they might need it. Elise later found the note describing Donna's harrowing ride in her handwriting at the crime scene. Donna also told Mark about the experience, and though he played a part of the supportive husband and helped her file the complaint, it turned out that he had old terrier motives for doing so. Just days later, Mark invited Harrington to their home, perhaps under the pretense of helping him get his job back. On the August 29, 1995, the cab driver wrote Mark's name, address, and the time on a scrap of paper in his car, drove to the Wingers' home, walked inside with a coffee cup and a pack of cigarettes, and was shot twice in the head. Mark Winger then called 911 and told the dispatcher he'd just shot a man who was killing his wife. He informed police that he'd been walking on the treadmill in the basement when he heard a commotion upstairs. He grabbed his gun, went to investigate, and found Harrington swinging a hammer at Donna. In an effort to defend his wife, he'd shot the man twice. Police arrived on the scene to find that both Donna and Harrington still had a weak pulse. Mark was in a back bedroom rolling back and forth in total shock. When former Springfield Police Detective Charlie Cox arrived at the Wingers' home, he remembered they could see the victims from the front door. Donna was clinging to life, said Sangamon County Assistant State Attorney Steve Weinholt. She had been hit no less than 7 times in the head with a hammer. The second victim, a white man, had suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head, but still had a pulse when police arrived, said Weinhoff. It was quite chaotic, Cox said. I knew that they were probably going to be transporting the victim soon, so I wanted to try and get identification on the male suspect. Cox found the man's wallet and was able to identify him as Roger Harrington. Police recovered a bloody hammer near the 2 bodies and found Mark's .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun, a yellow mug, and a pack of cigarettes on the same dining table. They also noticed that Harrington's car had been parked against traffic facing the wrong direction. At the crime scene, Cox said Mark was very upset and very emotional, and that he repeatedly asked who the man he'd killed was. Cox avoided identifying Harrington and tried to calm Mark down. As police combed through the scene, Mark asked police if the intruder's name was Roger. Cox confirmed that it was. Mark was shocked, and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's the man who's been harassing my wife this week," Cox said. Cox, who was familiar with Harrington after he'd lived in a trailer park owned by Cox, believed Harrington might have snapped. "I knew him as a very volatile type subject. He and his wife rented a trailer for me," Cox said. "Knowing what I knew about Mr. Harrington in the past, how quick he was to anger, I thought that very well he could have gone over there to try to get his job back. There's a hammer laying right there on the table. He picks it up and goes into a rage. Then the husband shoots the bad guy." Tragically, both victims succumbed to their injuries. After learning about Donna's previous run-in with Harrington and listening to Mark's version of events, the police closed the case within days, listing Roger Harrington as the culprit. Because once police examined the scene and listened to Mark's story, detectives concluded that he had acted in self-defense. The case was closed in about 48 hours, Weinhold said. But Harrington's family insisted from the beginning that their son was harmless. He was no troublemaker. He was a good kid. He wouldn't even strike at anybody, his mother, Helen Harrington, said. "I don't think he would hurt anybody, and I don't think he was crazy." So it seemed like Mark Winger was going to get away with murder. Donna's mother spoke to the media about the evening, and the family received the news of her daughter's murder. "It was 4 a.m, and I said, 'Jenny, it's Mom. Something terrible has happened,' Sarah Jane Drescher said of her call to Levin. "We sat there in my room just crying at this unimaginable loss," Levin said. In the following months, Donna's mother and sister took turns traveling to Illinois to help take care of Bailey. "I loved Mark because he loved Donna, and that's what was important to me," Sarah Jane Drescher said. "But I had to be very careful because I did not want to ruin my relationship with him because I did not want to ruin my relationship with the baby. I wanted to be a grandma, and Bailey made me a grandma." Mark was now a single father raising his infant daughter on his own. Donna's family initially flew to Illinois to help out, but they couldn't stay and they suggested Mark hire a nanny. In January 1996, he met 23-year-old Rebecca Simic, who was searching for a nanny job in the area. Rebecca told reporters, "It just felt like Bailey was the one that really needed me the most. She had been through so much already at the age of 3 months." Rebecca was wonderful with Bailey, and even Donna's family agreed that she was like an angel sent to help Mark. While she felt a little uncomfortable in the house where 2 people had died violently, she was dedicated to giving Bailey a good childhood despite the trauma of losing her mother. "I didn't want to like Rebecca, but it was hard not to like her," Levin said. "Seeing her with Bailey, there was really nothing bad we could say about her. Meanwhile, Rebecca's role at Mark's home had begun to evolve. When you live with someone and you're taking care of a child together, it's very easy to kind of play house. Rebecca said later on. Rebecca told the media that she was blown away by what the infant had been through in such a short time. Mark made me feel like I was like an angel sent to him from God or Donna, and it was my purpose to make this family whole again, Rebecca said. She lost 2 mothers by the time she was 3 months old, and she was so smiley, Rebecca said. I wanted to get in there and say, I'm gonna help, and I'm gonna make this little girl's life better. Mark helped Rebecca feel at ease in her new role. After a few months, the two found themselves sharing conversation and a glass of wine at the end of a long day, and then one thing led to another as their relationship turned intimate. Within the year, Rebecca was pregnant with Mark's child. The couple eloped in Hawaii in October 1996, just 14 months after Donna's death. I remember asking him how he could move on so quickly, Rebecca later recalled, and he explained to me that when you have a good marriage, it's natural for you to just want that again. Rebecca said Mark had told her he wasn't able to have children, so she said she was very surprised when she found out she was pregnant with his child only months after moving in. Obviously, I wasn't careful. It was just kind of a shock, she said. Mark, on the other hand, was thrilled, Rebecca recalled. Felt like it was a victory to him, she said. Mark put pressure on me to marry him and have children with him. Rebecca said that Mark, who was Jewish when they met, even started going to church with her. She said he told her they could raise a family in a Christian home. I would be honored to be your husband and blessed if you were my wife, Mark wrote in a letter to Rebecca. March Rabbi Michael Datz asked him about his change in faith, and he said that Mark explained Judaism is just too difficult and unforgiving. Rabbi Datz didn't understand, asking, Mark, I don't know what you're talking about. What do you need forgiveness for? He said Mark didn't respond. But then it seemed like Mark was trying almost a little too hard to leave the past behind. 16 months after his wife's death, Mark told Sarah Jane Drescher that he was going to sell the house where her daughter Donna had died and buy another one just outside of town. He and Rebecca had started a family of their own, and he started cutting ties with Donna's parents. I received a letter from Mark one day saying to me I could not be called Grandma, Sarah Jane Drescher said. I wrote him back and I begged him, please let her call me Grandma. And he said, I'm sorry. There's no way I am going to allow her to call you Grandma, and that's the way it is. Sarah said she mourned that loss for a long time. Bailey Simic, now 25, told reporters that her grandmother and grandfather, Ira Drescher, would send a birthday card to her every year. I always remember asking my mom, who's Sarah Jane and Ira? She said. My mom would always explain, like, those are Donna's parents, and they just want to let you know that, like, they love you and that they remember you. Eventually, Mark sold the house where Donna had died and moved with his new wife to the suburbs outside of Springfield. Things seemed great on the surface. They had 3 children together and Rebecca raised Bailey as her daughter. Though chaotic, their life seemed almost perfect. Mark was a loving partner and a very involved father. That would all change quite soon. One day in early 1999, when Mark was feeling ill, Rebecca took him to the emergency room in the hospital where Donna had worked before her death. There, they saw Donna's best friend and co-worker, Diane Schultz. She seemed upset to see Mark, and Rebecca remembered that Diane had acted strangely when she first came on Bailey's nanny, as if she were anxious to stay involved in Bailey's life. After they returned home, Mark commented that that may not be the last they heard from Diane. He was right. In February 1999, Diane dropped a bombshell on the police, revealing that she and Mark had been having an affair before Donna's death. She said that at one point, he'd remarked to her that things would be easier for them if Donna was dead. She told them that after Donna's faithful ride with Roger Harrington, Mark said that he needed to get that driver to the house. All you'd need to do is find the body, he told her. Diane never thought Mark was serious, but when Donna turned up dead soon after, she knew he had done it. Mark had threatened her not to tell anyone about the things he'd said, and she'd attempted suicide several times while struggling with her guilt. After seeing him in the hospital, she decided she couldn't keep quiet any longer. After hearing Diane's story, police decided to take a closer look at the evidence from the day of the murders. The more they thought about what they'd once assumed was an open and shut case, the more questions they had. Why were there no signs of forced entry into the Winger home that August day? Why would Roger Harrington bring his cup of coffee and cigarettes into the house with him if he'd planned to attack Donna? And why would he use the Winger's hammer as a weapon when he had a tire iron and a knife in his car? At that point, investigators came upon 3 never-before-seen Polaroid photos taken the day of the murders. They'd been, with the evidence collected in a civil suit, Mark had filed against the transportation company that had employed Harrington. The position of the bodies in the photos showed that Mark's version of events were not possible. Mark Winger had stated that Roger Harrington was kneeling right next to Donna Winger's head, and he was beating her with a hammer, Weinhoff explained. He stated that he shot him and that the man fell backward so that his feet remained near Donna's head. In reality, the Polaroid photographs show the exact opposite. Blood spatter experts agreed. Cox later told the media, "I was ashamed of the way the investigation went. I heard Roger Harrington's family. I ran his name through hell for no reason. I mean, he was an innocent victim." It had become clear that Mark was the real murderer behind the scenes the whole time. Rebecca Simic was left to make sense of the tragedy. She had no idea what Mark was capable of, and afterward, she moved her 4 children out of Springfield to feel safer. While Mark had tried to keep Bailey away from Donna's family, Rebecca encouraged them to be reunited. "We'd been hurt a lot by the same person," Rebecca said, "but it didn't break us." Donna's family and Rebecca spoke to reporters about the horrific realization that Mark was a manipulative killer hiding behind the mask of a brilliant engineer and a kind, loving husband and father. In December 1999, more than 4 years after the murders, the Springfield State Journal-Register ran an article based on allegations in the civil lawsuit that Mark had arranged the murder himself and killed both his wife and Harrington. The allegations were based on a blood spatter expert hired by BART Transportation in the case after the arrest of their employee Harrington. Everything came to a head. "It changed everything," Rebecca said of the article. "I mean, it went from Mark as the hero who was defending his wife, this noble stand-up guy that every man wanted to pat on the back, to a manipulative, deviant murderer." As the detectives continued their reinvestigation, they learned that Harrington's roommate, Susan Collins, had initially told police that someone asked to meet with Harrington on the day of the murders, and that she had seen Harrington on the phone arranging that meeting. Inside Harrington's car, they found a note written on a bank deposit slip with Mark's name, his address, and the time to be there. Roger Harrington was not an intruder, but rather he was lured into that home by Mark Winger, Weinhoff said. Diane Shelton's cooperation with police and evidence that raised questions about Mark's story prompted the voluntary dismissal of the civil suit against BART Transportation. "I didn't see it coming," Rebecca said. "I didn't know that this whole investigation was brewing. I never thought the whole time that they thought my husband was a diabolical murderer." A warrant was issued for Mark's arrest, and he was taken into custody while at work. "I had made plans to go to McDonald's Playlander," Becca recalled. "We were there and I got a phone call and it was Mark's secretary, and she told me that Mark had just been arrested. I was just sick, like my whole body kind of went numb, and I just couldn't believe it. I was shaking so badly, and I just remembered feeling so scared. I felt that I owed it to him and to my kids to just stand by him," she said. Hanson, Donna's sister, said she didn't feel relieved following Mark's arrest. "I still wanted to believe he was innocent," she said. "Here's this person that I know in handcuffs, and what's going to happen?" Bailey was just 6 years old at the time of Mark's arrest. She said no longer having her father home was scary. "I just remember everyone just trying to remain calm and kind of, at the time, being like, Dad's just going away for a while and that he'll be back soon," she said. But that was no longer possible. On August 23, 2001, Mark Winger was indicted for the murders of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington. At the trial in May 2002, a visibly shaky Dee testified against Mark. The court granted her immunity in exchange for her testimony, though there was no evidence linking her to anything other than keeping Mark's terrible secret. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. One of the key points the prosecution had to prove was that Harrington had gone to the house to meet with the Wingers, not to commit a murder. They presented the cigarettes and coffee mug that he'd brought inside, as well as the weapons he'd left in his car, and the note with Mark's name and address. Mark's attorney argued that Harrington was mentally ill, that he behaved erratically, and that these traits indicated he was capable of murder. When prosecutors presented the Polaroid showing the position of the bodies before they were removed from the scene, Mark's attorney argued throughout the trial that first responders could have moved the bodies. "It's our belief that Roger comes to the house. He's allowed into the home," now retired Detective Jim Graham said. "There were no signs of forced entry, and he was executed at that time." Hearing the gunshot, Donna Winger then comes from the bathroom to investigate. He then beats his wife to death with a hammer. Mark then calls 911. In the 911 call, someone can be heard moaning in the background when Mark tells the operator he can hear his baby crying and hangs up. He had told the operator there was a bullet in Harrington's head. But when police arrived, Harrington had been shot twice. Diane also gave damning testimony at the trial, saying that Mark told her it would be easier if Donna just died. "I thought it was crazy talk," she said during her cross-examination. After a chance meeting years later, Diane testified that she confronted Mark in the hopes of gathering information and asked him how he lived with himself, and that he'd replied that he had found Jesus Christ and was forgiven. She said he warned her that if she ever said anything, they would both be in trouble. "I didn't think that anybody would believe her," Rebecca said. "I just thought if Mark truly did that, she would have come forward right away." Mark's defense argued that Diane was emotionally unstable and just a woman who had been scorned. Diane Schultz's testimony was able to demonstrate that in reality, Mark was obviously unhappy, unfaithful, and had specifically talked about wanting to kill his wife, Weinhold said. Schultz was granted immunity for her testimony, he added. There was no direct evidence that directly linked Diane to actively participating in this crime. In the end, she was such a valuable witness as it relates to presenting the motive. After a trial that lasted 3 weeks, the jury found Mark Winger guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Rebecca said she believed he would be going home with them. After the verdict, she said the words guilty rang through her head and that she wanted the earth to open up and swallow me. Sarah Jane Drescher and her daughters, Donna's sisters, were with her when they heard the verdict. "The 3 of us just embraced and cried," she said. And the story gets even more twisted because 4 years later, Mark was also sentenced to an additional 35 years in prison when he tried to hire a hitman to kill Deanne or testifying against him. He even attempted to put out a hit against a childhood friend who had refused to pay his bail. Helen Harrington was relieved and grateful that her son had been vindicated of Donna's murder. "We knew that Roger was innocent, and it finally got proven," she said. "He was branded a murderer at the time, but then all this came to an end." The police also had to come to terms with the faulty initial investigation. "I was ashamed of the way the investigation went," Cox said. "I heard Roger Harrington's family. I ran his name through hell for no reason. I mean, he was an innocent victim." The police department had too hastily closed the case and turned a blind eye to some red flags. "And to right such a wrong, it felt great," Bram added. But Rebecca said there wasn't any closure for her or her family. "When we lose someone, we gather. We have a funeral," Rebecca shared. "But when someone goes to prison, well, what do? You're just kind of left with this emptiness and this hole that you can't really have closure with that." "It wasn't just him being sentenced to life," she said. "We were sentenced to a life of a father in prison." Bailey Simic says she missed having her father around while growing up. "It was really hard being in school seeing all the other kids have their dads in that relationship," she said. "And now suddenly, I couldn't just go to my dad's room or have him pick us up from school or anything like that." Ben Simic was only a year old when his dad went to prison. "Prison. I can look at the pictures and look at myself and say, that kid has no idea. He was way too young to know anything that was going on," he said. Rebecca had to move out of Springfield with her kids, and the home that she'd bought with Mark was foreclosed. She had been a stay-at-home mom for 7 years, so she had no option but to file for bankruptcy. "I didn't have anything to give my kids. Everything had been taken away. All I had was love," she said. Rebecca never remarried as far as we know. She raised all 4 of the children on her own, and Bailey has since reunited with Donna's family. "It was so incredible to see that there's this whole big family that loves me. And Sarah Jane still has my baby picture on her kitchen counter with all of her other grandkids even though we've been gone for so long," she said. "We've been hurt a lot by the same person, But it didn't break us, Rebecca said. Although Sarah Jane Drescher says there will never be closure for the murder of her daughter, the family has worked together to set up Donna's Fund, which is a part of Women in Distress, an organization that works to provide shelter for women trying to escape abuse. I think her legacy will live on through people that we help, Levin said, and through the beautiful memories that we have of her. So what do you think of this crazy, twisted case of murder uncovered? Would Mark Winger still be walking scot-free today if his former lover, Diane Schultz, hadn't developed a guilty conscience? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section, and don't forget to like, share, and hit the subscribe for more in-depth coverage of some of the most manipulative murders of all time. Juan Fernando Hermoso Suarez came into the world on February 28, 1976, amidst the picturesque province of Tucumbios in Ecuador. His early life was shrouded in mystery, with no concrete information about his biological father and his mother, a humble laundry worker struggling to provide for him. Consequently, when Juan was just a year old, destiny intervened, leading to his adoption by Rafael Hermosa and Zoila Suarez, a compassionate couple longing for children. They resided in a small and tranquil city in Ecuador until 1982, when a significant change transpired. Rafael sold their farm, and the family relocated to Quito, the vibrant capital of Ecuador. Initially, Juan's life appeared to follow a typical trajectory. He experienced the ups and downs of childhood, marked by occasional erratic moods. However, a pivotal moment occurred when he was around 7 years old. A young girl named Gloria entered the Hermosa family's life, altering its course. Gloria, at the tender age of 14, unveiled a startling revelation. She was Juan's sister. Gloria sought refuge with the Hermosa family, as her stepfather had cast her aside. Rafael and Zoila, known for their compassion, welcomed Gloria into their home. As time passed, Gloria found herself alone with Juan and chose to share a life-altering secret. Juan was adopted. This revelation, delivered without much consideration for his age and emotional readiness, left Juan grappling with profound questions. Gloria's presence also brought strife into the household, as she frequently disparaged Rafael and Zoila to Juan. Her tales included speculations about theft and flight from their home. Gloria's turbulent and disruptive behavior made it difficult for her to coexist with the Hermosa family, and she soon moved on. Juan's response to this revelation was tumultuous. As he mustered the courage to confront his adoptive parents, tears welled up in his eyes. He posed the painful question of whether it was true that Rafael and Zoila were not his biological parents. Faced with the heart-wrenching truth, they had no choice but to share the details of Juan's adoption. Some people have the notion that criminal behavior can be attributed solely to the influence of Juan's upbringing. In this case, Juan's adoptive parents, though imperfect, made sincere efforts to guide him down the right path. Nevertheless, it became increasingly evident that Juan's trajectory was far from conventional. Juan's journey took a tumultuous turn as he spiraled into rebellion, crossing the boundary of typical childhood behavior at the tender age of 9. It was during these formative years that he began a disturbing pattern of animal cruelty, primarily targeting cats. He would make Cabrillo bring their lifeless remains to school, seeking to shock and garner attention. Unsurprisingly, these actions resulted in multiple expulsions from school. In an attempt to curb his unruly behavior, Rafael, his adoptive father, resorted to occasional corporal punishment. Yet, his discipline never escalated to a level it could be deemed excessive. In fact, it was evident that Juan did not hold any lingering grudges against Rafael or Zoila, his adoptive mother. Rafael's work commitments frequently led him to travel, leaving Juan with more unsupervised time. Although Zoila provided some company, her hearing impairment and struggles with arthritis prevented her from being a constant presence. Consequently, Juan found himself increasingly isolated. Completing elementary school at the age of 12 was a significant accomplishment for Juan, given his penchant for petty theft. He had already embarked on a path of pilfering, selling whatever items he could lay his hands on. Remarkably, his criminal endeavors thus far had entailed relatively low levels of risk. However, at the age of 13, Juan became embroiled in a reckless car theft escapade alongside older boys. Assuming the role of a passenger, they initially evaded capture. Their audacious greed, however, led them to steal yet another vehicle, resulting in their apprehension. Juan's subsequent placement in a juvenile correctional facility underscored the urgent need for reform within these institutions. In the majority of cases, these facilities only serve to further entrench delinquent behavior, treating these young individuals as hardened criminals. The meager mental assistance provided took the form of disconnected lectures, falling short of addressing their unique needs. Ultimately, these facilities inadvertently fostered camaraderie among these youths, often amplifying the influence of the already deeply troubled. Contrary to expectations, Ullman found himself targeted within the correctional facility, not due to his physical stature or menacing appearance, but as a victim of severe bullying. Physical assaults and harsh verbal taunts became a daily ordeal. Amid this grim backdrop, a fellow inmate named Luis Anibal, merely 2 months older than Juan, entered the scene. Sharing a background of financial hardship, Luis's mother worked as a cleaner, but he had not been placed for adoption. Luis's circumstances were even more dire, with an abusive stepfather, mistreatment of his mother, and his sister subjected to similar horrors. Luis's unable found himself on a perilous path marked by thefts and altercations, eventually leading him to the correctional facility. His presence there was not the consequence of a specific crime, but rather a desperate measure enacted by his mother, who hoped to redirect him onto the right track, only to inadvertently exacerbate his situation. Extended stays in the correctional facility, combined with shared experiences and a profound sense of disconnection from mainstream society, brought together these young men who struggled to forge connections elsewhere. In a bold endeavor, they even hired a taxi driver on an hourly basis to impart driving lessons. In no time, they became proficient behind the wheel of a car, coincidentally a taxi. The prospect of learning to drive infused these young men with excitement, for it heralded the initiation of their car theft endeavors. Their maiden foray into auto theft involved a Hyundai Accent, a venture that left no casualties, except for Juan and Anibal themselves, who, presumably due to nerves, met with a road mishap. Providentially, their escapade went unnoticed and they managed to elude capture. Their subsequent car theft also ended in an encounter with law enforcement. However, they had meticulously prepared for such an eventuality, carrying counterfeit credentials purporting them to be the offspring of officers stationed in Quito. It goes without saying that these claims were entirely fabricated, unbeknownst to the genuine officers. Fortuitously for the boys, they were intercepted by a surgeon and a corporal who were unacquainted with the officers they impersonated, hence readily accepting the spurious credentials. Inquisitive officers questioned the boys about the car, intuitively discerning that it was unusual for the child of an officer to possess such a vehicle. Displaying remarkable cunning, the boys explained that it was a stolen car their father had managed to recover. The officers, harboring suspicions, suggested changing the vehicle's tires. It's important to note that some may not be familiar with the prevalent practice in Latin America, where police recover stolen cars, strip them of valuable parts for resale, and subsequently lay blame on the thieves for causing damage to the vehicle. The boys consented, offering to replace any components with lower quality substitutes in exchange for monetary compensation. The officers agreed, and an arrangement that left all parties content ensued. This modus operandi persisted for a while, initially yielding limited results. While leaving a disco with friends on November 22, 1991, the Juan and his group took a taxi. Hermoso pulled out a pistol obtained through a guard, shooting the driver in the head and killing him instantly. One of his friends then drove the vehicle to the southeast of the city and disposed of the body in the Los Cayos Valley, where the body was found by police the next day. A week later, Hermoso went with other members of his gang to a hairdresser, where he usually fixed his hair, operated by a transgender named Charlie. Charlie invited them to drink at home, where they started an argument which ended in Hermoso shooting Charlie 5 times before he could ask for help. Hermoso's crimes totaled 22 murders, occurring in only 4 months, claiming the lives of 8 taxi drivers, 11 homosexuals, a truck driver and his acquaintance, as well as 2 others, earning him the nickname the Kid of Terror. The victims were shot to death with a pistol, the crimes occurring during the weekends, which caused a panic among the taxi drivers and homosexuals who lived in northern Quito. One fateful morning, patrolling officers were alerted by what sounded like gunshots, prompting them to initiate a strategic sweep of the vicinity. Guided by the direction of the gunshots, they arrived on an almost deserted street, where a taxi was observed traversing the area. Reacting swiftly, the officers accelerated, overtaking the taxi and discerning the presence of several minors inside. Recognizing that the police were in pursuit, the young individuals accelerated. Yet the officers were undeterred, maintaining their vigilance. And when they realized that escaping in the taxi wasn't going to be possible, they stopped and opened all 4 doors to run in opposite directions. They were only able to capture one suspect, and that was Luis Anibal. Luis was taken to the police station and they began questioning him to get a confession, but he didn't utter a single word. Days passed, along with threats because the taxi he fled from belonged to a man who had been murdered a few hours earlier. Still, Luis remained silent, until a group of boys came to visit him to see what was going on with him. This seemed odd to the police because they had kept this capture hidden and only a few relatives knew that Luis was there. These boys, seeing that Luis couldn't get out, left the place. But the officers, seeing that the presumed suspects were minors and their profile matched perfectly, assigned an undercover officer to see what their next moves would be. Throughout the day, the detective saw that these boys seemed to spend the whole day together, hanging out in the streets. In the evening, they entered a nightclub, and more agents were called to see if they would take the bait that was about to be set. In the early morning, when the boys left the nightclub, a taxi passed nearby and they stopped it. Several agents were already following the taxi, and indeed, these boys had the intention of assaulting the taxi driver, but he was also an agent and practically the whole gang of terror was captured. But their leader, Juan, had not been with them. Under pressure, the boys confessed, but they claimed they were not responsible for the murders and that Juan Carlos was the culprit. Juan Carlos was the name Juan Fernando used to have a different identity as a criminal and protect his real identity. In contrast, Luis used the alias Santiago. The police began to investigate Juan Fernando Hermoso and found his address. At that time, Juan lived with Zoila and Rafael was not at home. On January 14, 1992, in the early morning, several officers began to surround Juan's house and entered through a skylight. Juan realized this, grabbed his gun, and a shootout ensued. Unfortunately, since he was sleeping in the same bed with his mother, and she may not have heard due to her deafness, she stayed in bed. In the exchange of fire, Zoila was hit by 19 bullets, leading to her death. Juan attempted to escape, threw a grenade at the police, and when he was climbing out of a window to escape, he was captured. Subsequently, following Juan's grenade launch, testimonies surfaced from both Juan and the neighbors, attesting that it was, in fact, the police who had lobbed the grenade. Countless enigmas enveloped the circumstances leading to Zoila's tragic fate. It raises questions about why she was swiftly transported away in an ambulance when it was patently evident that she had already departed from this world. Standard procedure dictates that when someone is unmistakably deceased, they should remain at the scene for forensic evaluation. Upon his arrival at the police precinct, Juan unambiguously declared, as I quote, "I want to clarify that my name is Juan Fernando Hermoso Suarez, and on February 28th, I will celebrate my 16th birthday." This stratagem was employed to exploit legal provisions given his status as a minor, and it elicited an explosion of media coverage. Juan ascended to a newfound level of notoriety, capturing the headlines in every newspaper. On numerous occasions, he participated in interviews for which he received compensation. Juan took all the blame for himself and wanted to leave his companions out of it. However, seeing that he also didn't want to receive many years in prison, he began to create excuses, claiming that a supposed general who does exist had hired him to commit all these crimes because of the death of his daughter, which was attributed to a supposed taxi driver. This was taken seriously because the other kids also started saying the same thing. The authorities were so stirred by this that they seriously began to investigate the general. They asked these kids about how he looked and they said he was of average height and had prominent hair, but that wasn't accurate. He was tall and always had a military haircut. It also makes perfect sense that a general with all the connections in the world would hire a 15-year-old kid like Juan, who was a complete stranger. The authorities dismissed the accusations and Juan began to make more excuses. Now he claimed that the taxi drivers were responsible for their own deaths. Clearly, he was still a child. He insisted that the last thing he wanted was to kill. He stated, "I asked them to stay still, that nothing would happen to them, but that didn't happen. Once again, I was threatened with a revolver, so I used my weapon, and a taxi driver tried to hit me with a lug wrench, so I was also forced to shoot." But even if that were true, this excuse wouldn't hold up because he had murdered 22 people by that point. There was no way he could be saved because he was young. It's not like he was suddenly going to turn his life around, and Juan confirmed this. At the time of his trial, Juan was already 16 years old and was sentenced to just 4 years at an orientation center because that was the maximum penalty for a minor in Ecuador. Juan underwent several psychological exams, which mostly described him as an organized psychopath. This type of psychopath tends to be natural leaders, and it was within 16 months of being in that center that Juan formed a gang and devised a plan to escape. He had a girl who had accompanied him in a previous taxi robbery arranged to meet him on the day of his visits. They had agreed that she would deliver a pistol to him so he could escape. In a juvenile center, the security wasn't as high, and Juan knew that at some point, there would only be one guard watching the exit. When this happened, he seized the opportunity and shot the sole remaining guard with 5 shots, causing his death. Immediately, Juan and 10 other young people managed to escape from there. The news once again exploded, and somehow, Juan quickly managed to escape to Colombia, reaching Bogota. He began to live off the sale of stolen jewelry, but being in a new country where he was also being pursued, he couldn't steal as easily as he could in Ecuador. So, shortly after, he was found and tired of going hungry. He told the police, "Yes, I am Juan Fernando Hermoso," and he was sent back to Ecuador. He was temporarily placed in a high-security cell but was soon returned to the same orientation center from which he had escaped before. However, this time he didn't escape again. He didn't even serve the initial 4-year sentence they had given him, despite having killed a guard and escaped to Colombia. Many couldn't believe it, but in January 1996, Juan was already free, and this obviously caused a lot of resentment in many people who saw the judicial system as a failure. Juan returned to his childhood town where he began to live with Rafael. In the early days, Juan seemed enthusiastic about finding a job, but no one wanted to hire him until Rafael contacted a friend who could give Juan a job in a bus collecting money. He started working and gradually began to enjoy the nightlife again, although it is assumed that he only went out to party and consume alcohol. On February 26, 1996, Juan had gone out with some friends to a bar around 10 p.m. At 12, the bar owner asked him to leave because the more the other customers consumed alcohol, the more they expressed their disgust for Juan, as his face and what he had done were known throughout the country. He had no choice but to board a bus and leave. 2 days later, Rafael received a call from the police, informing him that they had found what appeared to be his son's body near a river. The body was unrecognizable, not due to decomposition, but because it had been beaten, tortured, and assaulted in every possible way, even run over by a car with his hands tied with wire. He was only identified as Juan because he had his identification in his pockets, and next to the body, they had left a newspaper clipping that said, "The Hermoso Syndrome throughout the country." The body was found on the same day that Juan was supposed to turn 20. Some say that the perpetrators were contacts of the officers he had deals with, but it could have been anyone because this young man had made enemies from all sides. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.